The pit of despair. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and fear. Chains rattled in the dimly lit cavern, the sound echoing through the deep underground tunnels. The Vorak slavers had no mercy. They had thrown their captives into this pit, a place where hope had long since died. Zaya sat against the cold stone wall, her wrists raw from the metal shackles that bound her. Like the others, she had stopped fighting long ago. There was no escape. The Vorak were brutal, their guards carrying shock batons that could knock out a full-grown warrior with a single strike. If anyone tried to resist, they were dragged away, never seen again. She had been here for months, maybe longer. Time had no meaning in the pit. The only way to track the days was by the few minutes of artificial light that flickered on when food was thrown down. Small, tasteless blocks of protein, barely enough to survive. But today was different. A new prisoner was brought in. The heavy metal gate groaned open, and two Vorak guards shoved a man forward. He stumbled but didn't fall. He was human. Zaya's breath caught in her throat. A human. She had heard stories. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy. The Vorak usually avoided them. They were dangerous, wild, unpredictable survivors. The human lifted his head and looked around, his sharp green eyes scanning the pit with curiosity, not fear. That was strange. Everyone feared this place. But this man, he almost looked amused. "Move." One of the Vorak guards growled and slammed the butt of his weapon into the human's back. He grunted but didn't fall. Instead, he turned his head slightly and smiled. Smiled. Zaya had seen strong warriors crumble under the Vorak's cruelty. She had seen the light fade from the eyes of those who once believed in freedom. But this man, he was smiling. The guards grunted in annoyance and unshackled him, pushing him toward the other prisoners. "Welcome to your new home, human," one sneered before slamming the gate shut behind them. The human dusted off his torn shirt as if he had just walked in from a casual stroll. He had dark hair, a muscular build, and a face marked with old scars. He didn't look broken like the others. He looked ready. Zaya kept her eyes on him as he walked toward the nearest wall and sat down. He leaned back casually, stretching his legs out. Another prisoner, a four-armed reptilian named Galactic, scoffed. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice deep and bitter. "There is no escape, no hope. You might as well accept it." The human didn't answer immediately. He glanced at his metal cuffs, rubbing his wrists where the Vorak shackles had left red marks. Then, slowly, he looked up. His eyes locked onto Galactic's, and he grinned. "Oh, I get it," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "I just don't believe it." Zaya shivered. His words were simple, but there was something behind them, a promise. Galactic snorted. "You'll learn soon enough." The human chuckled and rested his arms behind his head, as if he were lounging in a comfortable chair. "We'll see." Zaya kept watching him, curiosity burning in her mind. Why wasn't he afraid? Did he know something they didn't? Later, when the food rations were thrown down, the prisoners scrambled for their share. Hunger turned even the weakest into fighters. The Vorak guards laughed as they watched the captives struggle over scraps. But the human, he didn't move. Zaya hesitated before picking up a small portion and walked over to him. "You should eat," she muttered, keeping her voice low. "You'll need your strength." He glanced at the food, then at her, and smirked. "Thanks, but I'm not planning on staying long." Her brow furrowed. "You don't have a choice." The human leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "Everyone thinks that until they leave." Her heart pounded. No one left the pit. No one. But as she stared into his eyes, she saw no doubt, no hesitation, only certainty. That night, as the others tried to sleep, Zaya couldn't take her eyes off him. He wasn't resting like the others. He was studying the pit, the walls, the chains, the guards above. And then, in the dim light, she saw it. He was smiling again. For the first time in months, Zaya felt something strange inside her. The human problem. The pit was always quiet at night. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of silence that came from exhaustion, from hopelessness. The prisoners didn't talk much once the dim lights flickered off. There was nothing to say, no plans to make, no dreams to whisper about. But tonight, Zaya couldn't sleep. Her gaze kept drifting toward the human, Ethan. He sat in the same spot where he had first landed, his back against the stone wall, his head tilted slightly as if lost in thought. But he wasn't asleep. He was watching, studying. Zaya had spent months in this pit, and she had never seen anyone do that before. Every prisoner here had learned to keep their head down, to accept their fate. Ethan was different. He wasn't accepting anything. She didn't know what to make of it. Finally, she pushed herself up and moved toward him, her shackles clinking softly. "What are you looking at?" she whispered. Ethan glanced at her. Even in the dim light, his green eyes held a strange intensity. "Exit points," he murmured. She blinked. "What?" He nodded toward the top of the pit, where metal platforms extended outward. Guards have 3 rotations before shift change. 2 at the main gate, 1 on patrol. The food hatch opens for exactly 13 seconds before locking again. Zaya stared at him. "You've been here for less than a day." Ethan smirked. "Doesn't take long to spot weaknesses." Zaya's pulse quickened. There are no weaknesses. No one escapes the pit. His expression didn't change. No one has tried the right way. She shook her head. This was madness. She had seen prisoners break under the Vorax cruelty. Even the strongest warriors eventually lost hope. Yet here he was, calm, smiling, as if he was planning a vacation instead of trying to escape an impossible prison. "You're crazy," she muttered. Ethan just grinned. "Maybe. Morning brings pain." When the lights flickered on, the Vorak guards stomped into the pit, their heavy boots sending dust into the stale air. It was morning, though there was no way to tell time down here. One of the Vorak, a massive brute with dark blue scales and a scar across his jaw, stomped toward the prisoners. He was called Crag, and he enjoyed causing pain. "Wake up, filth," he barked. "Time to work." Zaya and the others stood slowly, stretching sore muscles. The Vorak used their prisoners for manual labor, digging tunnels, moving heavy crates, reinforcing the underground passages. Not that anyone knew why. The Vorak didn't need these tunnels. They had ships, space stations, yet day after day, the prisoners were forced to dig deeper into the rock. As Zaya stood, she noticed Ethan was still sitting, watching Crag like a hunter studying prey. Her stomach tightened. "Don't do anything stupid, human." But Ethan just smirked as the Vorak slaver marched closer. Crag stopped in front of him. "Didn't you hear me, human?" Ethan tilted his head. "Yeah." The Vorak's reptilian eyes narrowed. "Then stand up." Ethan didn't move. A few prisoners nearby froze, sensing what was coming. Zaya clenched her fists. Crag growled. Then, with a flash of movement, the Vorak slammed his shock baton into Ethan's ribs. A sharp crack echoed through the cavern. Zaya winced. The other prisoners flinched. But Ethan laughed. Crag froze. "What?" Ethan grinned up at him. "That's it. I expected more." Zaya's breath caught. "Is he insane?" Crag snarled and struck him again, harder. The baton sent a jolt of blue energy through Ethan's body. He gasped, muscles tightening, but when it passed, he chuckled. "I've had worse." Crag's face twisted with rage. He grabbed Ethan by the throat, lifting him off the ground. "You think this is funny, human?" Ethan grinned. "A little." Crag roared and threw him across the pit. Ethan crashed into the hard ground, dust kicking up around him. Zaya flinched. "He's dead. He has to be." But then, Ethan groaned and sat up. He wiped blood from his lip and smirked. "That all you got?" The entire pit fell silent. The Vorak guards looked at each other. The prisoners stared. No one had ever laughed in Crag's face. Zaya's heart pounded. Crag took a step forward, but another Vorak, one of the commanders, barked an order. Enough. He still needs to work. If he resists again, kill him. Crag hesitated, then spat at Ethan before turning away. The other prisoners quickly shuffled toward the tunnels, avoiding Ethan's gaze. They had all learned a simple rule: don't provoke the Vorak. Ethan broke that rule in the worst way possible. Zaya lingered. She expected him to groan in pain, to wince as he stood. Instead, he grinned at her. "You see," he said, rolling his shoulder, "they're just bullies. And bullies only have power when people are afraid." Zaya shook her head. "You're insane." Ethan chuckled. "Nah, I just don't like being in cages." She felt something dangerous stir inside her. Hope. Again. And that was a problem. A dangerous whisper. That night, after another long, grueling day of digging, Ethan sat with his back against the wall again. Watching. Studying. Zaya sat next to him. She didn't know why. Maybe she needed answers. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. "You have a plan, don't you?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "I always have a plan." She frowned. "You can't fight your way out of here." Ethan smirked. "I don't need to fight." He glanced up at the guards, then at the shadows near the back of the pit. "I just need to be smarter than them." Zaya narrowed her eyes. "And?" Ethan turned toward her, his voice low, his gaze intense. "I am smarter than them." Zaya shivered, because for the first time, she actually believed him. The great escape. The pit had always been a place of silence, of hopelessness. But tonight, something was different. Something was changing. Zaya could feel it. She sat near the cold stone wall, pretending to rest, but her mind was racing. Across the pit, Ethan was still awake, his green eyes gleaming in the dim light. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking up. At the guards. At the metal gates. At the way out. No one escaped the Vorak's pit. No one. But for the first time, Zaya wasn't sure if that was true anymore. The final test. The next morning, the Vorak guards marched in like they always did. Heavy boots. Cold stares. Shock batons ready. The prisoners lined up for their daily work orders, dragging their exhausted bodies toward the tunnels. Zaya stole a glance at Ethan. He looked calm. Almost too calm. Then Crag appeared. The Vorak brute had been watching Ethan ever since the last incident. He hadn't forgotten how the human had laughed in his face. Crag was a creature of rage, and he wanted payback. Zaya's heart pounded. "Not now, not today. Please, don't do anything stupid, human." Crag stopped in front of Ethan. A slow, cruel smile stretched across his reptilian face. "Human," he sneered. "I think you need another lesson." Ethan tilted his head. "Yeah." He cracked his neck. "I think you're a slow learner, Crag." Zaya almost groaned. Crag's fist shot out. Fast. Brutal. But Ethan was faster. He moved at the last second, twisting his body, and Crag's punch missed. The Vorak stumbled forward, momentarily off balance. The other prisoners froze. The guards tensed. Ethan could have fought back. He could have made his move. But he didn't. Instead, he smirked and put his hands behind his head, like a man completely in control. Zaya realized it then. This wasn't just a fight. This was a test. Ethan was pushing Crag, provoking him, making him lose control. Because when a Vorak got angry, they got sloppy. And when they got sloppy, they made mistakes. The Vorak commander barked an order. "Enough. Take them to the workset." Crag growled but stepped back, glaring at Ethan. "I'll be watching you, human." Ethan just winked. "Good. You might learn something." Crag bared his sharp teeth. Zaya exhaled slowly. That was close. Too close. She leaned toward Ethan as they walked toward the tunnels. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" she whispered. Ethan smirked. "Nope. Just making sure they're paying attention." Her stomach twisted. "Why?" He glanced at her. "Because when I do escape, I want them to see it." Zaya shivered. "The plan begins." The work tunnels were deep. The Vorak forced the prisoners to dig into the rock every day, though no one knew why. They weren't mining for resources. They weren't expanding a base. So what were they looking for? Zaya didn't have time to wonder today. She was watching Ethan. He worked quickly, not because he had to, but because he was timing something. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the guards, toward the ventilation shafts, toward the supply carts that came and went. He was memorizing everything. And then, he moved. It was small, subtle, a shift of the foot, a tool left in the wrong place, a whispered word to a prisoner here, a nod to another there. Little pieces, little steps. The Vorak didn't notice, but Zaya did, and then she understood. Ethan wasn't just escaping. He was taking them all with him. The signal. Hours passed. The work shift ended. The prisoners returned to the pit. The Vorak guards did their usual lazy check of the tunnels, making sure everything was secure. They didn't notice the small details, the vent grates that were loose, the tool that had been bent just right, the hidden messages scratched into the rock. Zaya sat next to Ethan, her pulse racing. She whispered, "When?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared up at the sky, at the distant lights above the pit. Then he said, "Tonight." Her breath caught. "Tonight." Ethan leaned in, his voice soft but filled with certainty. "When the food hatch opens, I go first. I take down the nearest guard. You grab the keys. Gorlak and the others will block the exit. We climb. We run. We don't look back." Zaya's hands trembled. This is insane." Ethan smirked. "No, this is freedom." And deep down, she believed him. The great escape. The moment arrived. The food hatch opened. 13 seconds. Ethan moved. Fast. Too fast for the guards to react. 1 second. He leaped toward the nearest Vorak. 2 seconds. His fists slammed into the guard's throat. 3 seconds. He yanked the weapon free. 4 seconds. Zaya grabbed the keys. 5 seconds. The alarm blared. 6 seconds. Prisoners surged forward. 7 seconds. The first Vorak went down. 8 seconds. Zaya unlocked the chains. 9 seconds. Gorlak led a charge. 10 seconds. Ethan shot out the lights. 11 seconds. Chaos erupted. 12 seconds. They ran. 13 seconds. The Vorak realized they had already lost. The pit was no longer a prison. It was a battleground. Zaya climbed the metal scaffolding, her heart hammering. Blaster fire rained down. Prisoners screamed. Guards roared. But they kept moving. Ethan fought ahead of her, his movements precise, his attacks lethal. For the first time in her life, Zaya felt alive. Then, a roar. Crack. The Vorak brute charged, his massive form knocking prisoners aside. His eyes locked onto Ethan. Zaya's stomach dropped. Crag lunged. Ethan turned, his smile sharp as a blade. "Been waiting for you." They clashed. The pit erupted, and everything changed. Hunted across the stars. The battle inside the pit was over. But the real fight had just begun. The Vorak slavers never let their prey go. Zaya could feel it in the air, in the way the alarms blared through the night, in the way the Vorak soldiers scrambled to regain control. They weren't just angry. They were hunting. And she and Ethan were now the most wanted beings in the sector. The final blow. Zaya's chest heaved as she climbed the last section of the pit's metal scaffolding. The open night sky stretched above them, the first taste of freedom she had seen in months. But there was no time to admire it. The Vorak warlord, Crag, was still standing, and he was furious. The massive reptilian warrior stood in front of the only exit, his thick arms covered in fresh wounds from the prisoner's attack. But his eyes were locked on Ethan. Ethan, standing on the platform above, his breathing steady despite the fight. His lip was split, blood trailed down his cheek, but he was grinning. Zaya had seen warriors break under Crag's strength. She had seen them die. But Ethan, he wasn't afraid. "Give up, human," Crag growled, flexing his claws. "You've run far enough." Ethan chuckled. "You really don't get it, do you?" Crag's nostrils flared. "Get what?" Ethan tilted his head. "I was never running." Then he moved. Fast. Before Crag could react, Ethan grabbed a loose metal pipe from the platform's edge and swung it. The sickening crunch of metal against bone echoed through the pit. Crag staggered, stunned. Ethan didn't stop. He twisted around him, planting a boot into the Vorak's knee, making the brute buckle. Then he spun the pipe like a weapon and slammed it into Crag's head. The Vorak collapsed. The prisoners cheered. But Ethan just tossed the pipe aside and turned to Zaya. "Time to go." She swallowed and nodded. They had won the fight, but they still had to survive the war. Stealing a ship, the group moved fast, pushing through the dusty alien terrain outside the pit. A few prisoners had fallen behind in the escape, and the Vorak guards were already regrouping. Ethan led the way, weaving through rocky outcrops, staying low. His mind was already 3 steps ahead. "We need a ship," he said. Zaya's breathing was uneven. "And how exactly do you plan to steal one?" Ethan grinned. "Stealing is easy. Staying alive after, that's the hard part." Ahead, a Vorak landing zone came into view. Rows of sleek, predatory gunships gleamed under the pale moonlight. Soldiers rushed around, barking orders, trying to recover from the chaos of the breakout. Ethan crouched behind a rock, scanning the scene. 2 pilots near the loading bay, 3 guards on patrol, anti-air turrets at the east tower, he muttered. "Easy." Zaya stared at him. "That's easy to you." Ethan winked. "Stay close." Before she could protest, he was already moving. Fast, silent, deadly. He slipped behind the first guard, grabbing the Vorak's thick wrist and twisting. A sickening crack. The guard dropped before he could scream. Zaya bit her lip. "How does he do that?" Ethan motioned for her to follow. They reached the loading bay. 2 Vorak pilots stood by a small, fast attack craft, arguing. They didn't notice Ethan until it was too late. He struck fast, disarming one, slamming the other into the hull. Zaya ran forward, grabbing a fallen blaster. The alarm triggered. Vorak soldiers turned in their direction. Ethan cursed. Time to move. Zaya jumped into the cockpit. She had never flown a Vorak ship before. But Ethan, he knew exactly what to do. "Strap in," he said, flipping switches. The ship roared to life. The Vorak opened fire. Ethan yanked the controls, blasting into the sky. Dogfight in the void. The ship burst through the planet's atmosphere, shaking violently. But they weren't alone. 3 Vorak pursuit ships locked onto them, their weapons glowing red. Ethan grinned. Zaya gripped her seat. "What's so funny?" Ethan pushed the throttle forward. They don't know who they're chasing. The first enemy ship fired. Ethan rolled the ship hard, dodging the plasma blasts by inches. He yanked the controls left, then flipped the ship upside down, forcing one of the enemy pilots to overshoot. Zaya's stomach lurched. Ethan looped back behind them, switching power to the forward cannons. "Say goodnight," he muttered. Boom. The first ship exploded. The second one fired a missile. Ethan jerked the ship into a tight spiral, the missile barely missing before locking onto the third Vorak ship instead. The unlucky pilot tried to escape. Too late. The missile slammed into its target, turning it into a fireball. Only one enemy ship remained, and it was closing in. Zaya's breath came fast. We need to jump. Ethan's hands flew across the controls. The hyperdrive wasn't ready. The Vorak ship lined up its cannons. Zaya's stomach twisted. They weren't going to make it. Then, a miracle. A massive human warship dropped out of hyperspace. The Vorak pilot hesitated for a second. Ethan didn't. He pulled the ship hard right, hit the hyperdrive, and gone. Aftermath. Zaya's hands trembled as she looked out at the swirling blue light of hyperspace. They had done it. They had escaped. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling. That was fun. Zaya stared at him. Fun. She shook her head and let out a breathless laugh. You're insane. Ethan just smirked. Took you this long to figure that out. She sighed, her heart finally slowing down. But then, a warning light flashed. Zaya's stomach sank. Someone was tracking them. Ethan's smile faded. Looks like the Vorak aren't done with us yet. Zaya's fingers curled into fists. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The Vorak's revenge. The Vorak never let their prey escape. Zaya knew that. Ethan knew that. Yet here they were, sitting in the cockpit of a stolen Vorak ship, watching the blinking red light on the navigation panel. They were being tracked. Again. Ethan's fingers flew across the console, but the signal was locked in. Zaya clenched her jaw. How? We jumped to hyperspace. There's no way they could have tagged us. Ethan exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing. Not unless they planted a tracer before we stole the ship. Zaya's stomach twisted. You mean, we brought the Vorak with us? Ethan gave a tight nod. Yeah. And if we don't do something fast, they'll be on top of us in minutes. Zaya's heart pounded. No, not after everything. They had escaped the pit. They had survived Crag's wrath, stolen a ship, and fought their way through a dogfight in the void. They were not about to be caught again. Ethan moved fast, pulling up a holographic star map. His green eyes flicked over the options, calculating distances, scanning for places to hide. Zaya swallowed hard. Where do we go? Ethan's jaw tightened. Nowhere. She stared at him. What? He turned toward her, voice calm, steady. If we run, they'll chase us. Doesn't matter where we go. They'll never stop. The Vorak don't forgive escapees. Zaya felt a chill crawl down her spine. What do we do then? Ethan met her gaze. And then he grinned. We stop running. Zaya's stomach dropped. Into the fire. The Vorak were coming. Their ships would drop out of hyperspace soon, locking onto their position like predators drawn to blood. And Ethan's plan? It was madness. Zaya sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring at the coordinates he had just entered. Her mind screamed at her to stop him. But she didn't. Because deep down she knew. Ethan Carter didn't lose. You're insane, she whispered. Ethan smirked. You keep saying that. Zaya let out a shaky breath. This was it. No turning back. Ethan pulled the throttle. The stolen Vorak ship veered sharply, changing course. Not away from danger. Straight into it. The Vorak fleet arrives. The starry void twisted as the ship dropped out of hyperspace. Zaya's breath caught. Ahead of them was a massive asteroid belt, a cluster of jagged rocks spinning in the emptiness of space, a death trap for any ship moving too fast. And behind them, the Vorak fleet. 3 warships emerged from hyperspace, their dark, predatory forms blocking out the stars. Zaya's blood ran cold. These weren't just any Vorak ships. This was a hunter fleet. They hadn't sent a few bounty ships. They had sent an armada. A deep dread settled in her chest. Ethan, we can't fight that. Ethan's hands tightened around the controls. We're not fighting. Zaya blinked. Then what? The first Vorak ship opened fire. Blazing red energy bolts tore through space, slicing toward them. Ethan didn't even flinch. He dived straight into the asteroid belt. The Vorak's biggest mistake. Zaya's vision blurred as the ship whipped between massive rocks, dodging them by inches. The Vorak ships followed. That was their mistake. The asteroid field was too tight, too unstable. The Vorak were built for brute force, not for precision flying. Ethan. He was built different. Zaya watched in awe and terror as Ethan twisted the ship in ways that shouldn't be possible. Their stolen ship skimmed past a spinning chunk of iron, barely squeezing through a narrow gap before slamming the thrusters in reverse, causing one of the Vorak ships to overshoot and crash straight into an asteroid. Boom! Zaya flinched as fire bloomed in the void. One down. 2 more to go. The Vorak warships fired relentlessly, their laser cannons carving through the asteroid belt. The entire battlefield was chaos. Explosions, debris, lethal energy beams. But Ethan kept moving, always one step ahead. Zaya's hands shook as she gripped her seat. "How are you doing this?" Ethan just smirked. "Back home, we had a game called chicken." Zaya blinked. "What?" Ethan jerked the ship hard, sending them into an unexpected spin. The second Vorak ship followed, right into the path of a massive asteroid. Too late to turn. The Vorak pilot realized his mistake an instant before impact. The ship slammed into the rock, exploding into fire and metal. Zaya's mouth fell open. Another one down. The final Vorak ship hesitated. Good. Ethan saw it too. He turned to Zaya, eyes gleaming. "You see, bullies only win when you're afraid." Zaya swallowed hard. She wasn't afraid anymore. Revenge of the Vorak. Ethan pulled the ship out of the asteroid field, breathing hard. Zaya's pulse was still racing, but they had done it. The Vorak fleet was crippled. They had escaped. Again. Ethan leaned back, exhaling. That went well. Zaya stared at him. Well, before she could say anything. The comm panel crackled to life. A voice, deep and filled with venom, echoed through the cockpit. "You think this is over, human?" Zaya's stomach dropped. No. Ethan's smirk faded. He pressed a button on the panel, activating the visual feed. And there, appearing in front of them, was the Vorak High Lord. Zaya's blood ran cold. He was massive, covered in dark, ridged armor, his reptilian eyes burning with hatred. He leaned forward, staring at Ethan through the transmission like he could see into his soul. "You have humiliated my people," the High Lord hissed. "You have defied the Vorak Empire." His expression darkened. "So now, human, I will destroy everything you love." Ethan's jaw clenched. Zaya saw his fingers tighten into fists. She had seen him smirk at danger. She had seen him laugh in the face of death. But now, he was furious. Ethan's voice was calm, deadly. "You can try." The Vorak High Lord's eyes narrowed. "Then let the war begin." Sacrifice and betrayal. War was coming. The Vorak High Lord had made it clear. Ethan Carter wasn't just an escaped prisoner anymore. He was an enemy. And the Vorak didn't just hunt enemies. They destroyed them. Ethan knew this. He had seen empires crush entire civilizations just to prove a point. He had watched governments sacrifice their own people in the name of power. And now it was his turn to stand in the fire. Only this time, he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for Zaya, for the prisoners they left behind, for everyone the Vorak had enslaved and discarded like broken tools. He had one chance to end this. But first, he had to survive the betrayal he never saw coming. A desperate gamble. Zaya sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring at the ship's console. The Vorak weren't giving up. The stolen vessel's long-range scanners flickered. They were still being tracked. Again. Zaya clenched her fists. "We destroyed the tracking signal. How are they still following us?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because they don't need a signal." Zaya frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan exhaled. They're not tracking the ship. He turned his green eyes toward her. They're tracking us. Zaya's stomach dropped. But how? Ethan sighed and stood up, motioning for her to follow. They moved to the ship's cargo hold, a small metal chamber filled with stolen Vorak supplies. And then, Ethan pulled out his knife and tossed it to her. Check my arm. Zaya blinked. What? Ethan gave her a pointed look. Do it. Her hand shook as she pressed the knife to his forearm and made a small incision. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a tiny metallic device slipped free from beneath Ethan's skin. Zaya's breath caught. A Vorak tracker. Ethan exhaled sharply, snatching it up. They tagged me when I was in the pit. He crushed the device under his boot. That's why they never lost us. Zaya's chest tightened. That meant, the Vorak are already coming, Ethan muttered. His gaze darkened. And we need to be gone before they get here. A betrayal in the shadows. They had one option, find allies. Ethan's mind raced as he scrolled through the ship's navigation logs. The Vorak had wiped out entire colonies, leaving them few places to hide. Then he saw it. Dredak 9. A smuggler's outpost, deep in neutral space. If anyone could help them, it was Kaz Malik, an old contact of Ethan's, a man who knew how to disappear. But when they arrived, something was wrong. The outpost was quiet, too quiet. Ethan's instincts screamed trap. But they had no choice. They docked in the main bay. The doors hissed open, and the stench of oil and burnt metal filled the air. Zaya followed close behind as Ethan led the way through the dim corridors. The outpost had seen better days. Cracked walls, flickering lights, the distant hum of security turrets. And then, a shadow moved. Ethan whirled, his blaster already drawn. A man stepped forward, hands raised. Kaz Malik. Tall, lean, a scar running across his cheek. His coat was lined with concealed weapons. Kaz grinned. Well, Carter. Thought you were dead. Ethan didn't lower his gun. Not yet. Kaz chuckled. Lucky you. Though, not sure that'll last. Ethan's stomach tightened. Something in Kaz's voice felt wrong. Zaya sensed it too. Her hand hovered near her own weapon. Ethan stared him down. What did you do, Kaz? Kaz sighed. I wish it wasn't like this, mate. Then, the alarms blared. Ethan's blood ran cold. A Vorak warship had just entered orbit. And Kaz, he just smiled. Sorry, Carter. Business is business. Betrayal. Captured again. The Vorak hit fast. Ethan and Zaya fought back, ducking behind cargo crates, firing blasters, dodging the first wave of stun grenades. But there were too many. Zaya gasped as a shock baton slammed into her back. Her vision blurred as she collapsed. Ethan turned, firing 3 quick shots, dropping Vorak soldiers before he was tackled from behind. Pain exploded through his skull. The last thing he heard was Kaz's voice, low and mocking. Should have stayed dead, mate. Then, darkness. The Vorak's ultimate weapon. Ethan woke up in chains. Not in a pit. Not in a prison. This was different. This was a throne room. The Vorak High Lord sat before him. Massive, armored, his reptilian face shadowed beneath a gleaming battle crown. Ethan gritted his teeth. You really like throwing me in chains, don't you? The High Lord chuckled. You make it easy. Ethan rolled his shoulders. So, gonna kill me? The Vorak leader leaned forward. No. Ethan frowned. The High Lord's eyes gleamed. You will die, Carter. But not yet. First, you will watch. A holographic display flickered to life. Zaya appeared, bound, unconscious, inside a Vorak containment cell. Ethan's chest tightened. The High Lord smirked. I will let her live, if you do one thing for me. Ethan's hands curled into fists. The Vorak leader stood. Kneel. Ethan's muscles locked. Zaya's life depended on his choice. The galaxy was watching. If he kneeled, he lived. But the Vorak would own him. If he refused, they'd kill him. And kill Zaya too. Ethan gritted his teeth. His mind raced. There had to be another way. Then, slowly, he smirked. "You want me to kneel," he said. The High Lord sneered. "Yes." Ethan's smile widened. "Then you should have chained my legs too." And then he moved. Defiance and victory. A true warrior never kneels. Ethan Carter wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a king or a hero from legend. But he was a fighter. And he sure as hell wasn't going to bow. Not to the Vorak. Not to anyone. The High Lord stood before him, smug in his victory. Arrogant. Powerful. Dangerous. Ethan was chained, bruised, and outnumbered. And yet he smiled. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. The last gamble. The Vorak High Lord watched him closely. Waiting. Ethan rolled his shoulders, testing the restraints around his wrists. They were strong. Too strong for him to break. But that was fine. He wouldn't need to. Still grinning, the High Lord sneered. His deep voice echoed through the throne chamber. "You should be begging." Ethan smirked. "Begging isn't really my style." The High Lord's nostrils flared. "You think this is a joke?" Ethan tilted his head. "No, I think it's the end of your empire." The Vorak leader stiffened. Then, boom, the entire worship shook. Alarms blared. The High Lord's eyes widened. "What did you do?" Ethan's smirk grew wider. "Me," he shrugged. "Nothing." Then he nodded toward the viewport behind the throne. The Vorak leader turned, just in time to see hell rain down. The uprising begins. Explosions lit up the void. Human ships burst out of hyperspace, weapons hot, tearing through the Vorak fleet. A stealth squadron maneuvered through the enemy formation, striking key command ships with surgical precision. At the front of the fleet was a single, heavily armed warship, a legend in its own right, the Liberator. And on the bridge, leading the charge, Zaya. She was supposed to be a prisoner, supposed to be locked away, helpless. But Ethan knew better. Zaya had never been helpless. She had escaped. She had found allies. And now, she was bringing hell with her. The Vorak High Lord roared in fury. "You think this will save you?" He turned back to Ethan. "You think a few ships will stop me?" Ethan laughed. "No," he said. Then he broke free. The fall of the Vorak. The High Lord had made one fatal mistake. He had left Ethan's legs unchained. And Ethan had waited for this exact moment. The second the Vorak turned his back, Ethan launched forward, twisting his entire body weight into the chains. Snap! The weakened metal restraint around his right wrist cracked. Pain flared through his arm, but he didn't stop. With a grunt, he yanked his arms forward, ripping the broken chain free from the wall. The High Lord spun around. Too late. Ethan moved fast. He lunged, yanking the chain like a whip, wrapping it around the Vorak's massive throat. The High Lord choked, clawing at the metal links. His guards rushed forward. But Ethan swung hard, pulling the massive Vorak into their path. The guards stumbled. Ethan pressed his advantage. Using the High Lord as a shield, he charged toward the nearest soldier. A quick strike, stolen weapon, firing blindly. A guard fell. Then another. The High Lord broke free, snarling, swinging his massive fist. Ethan dodged, barely avoiding a punch that would have crushed his skull. Then, a new voice echoed through the chamber. "Ethan, move." Zaya. She had made it inside. And she wasn't alone. A squad of freed prisoners stormed the throne room, weapons blazing. The Vorak guards scrambled to respond, but it was too late. Ethan had turned the High Lord's own ship into a battlefield. And this time, he wasn't the one in chains. The High Lord's final stand. The Vorak leader was furious. He bared his sharp teeth. "You think this changes anything?" Ethan rolled his shoulders. "Yeah." The High Lord lunged. For the first time, Ethan didn't move, because he didn't need to. Zaya fired first. A single shot, right into the Vorak's chest. The High Lord staggered, staring down at the burning wound. His breath came in ragged gasps. He tried to step forward, but his legs gave out. Ethan stood over him, watching the mighty Vorak ruler fall. The High Lord's eyes flickered. This is impossible." Ethan smirked. "Nah, it's just a bad day for you." The Vorak leader collapsed. And just like that, the war was over. A new beginning. Ethan and Zaya stood side by side, watching the Vorak warship burn. The once feared empire was in shambles. Their leader was dead. The freed prisoners had taken control. The Vorak fleet had either surrendered or fled. And for the first time, in a long time, Ethan Carter had nowhere to run. Zaya looked up at him. "So, what now?" Ethan exhaled. "Not sure." Zaya smirked. "You could try a quiet life." Ethan laughed. "Yeah, like that's ever worked out." She nudged him. "Maybe this time's different." Ethan looked around. At the survivors. At the people who had fought for their freedom. At the future they had just stolen back. And maybe, just maybe, she was right. Final scene. The legend begins. The galaxy would remember this day. They would remember the prisoner who defied the Vorak. The human who refused to kneel. The man who turned a pit of despair into a battlefield of hope. They would tell stories about Ethan Carter. And Ethan. He just smirked, stepping onto his new ship. "Let's find a new adventure." Then, the engines roared, and he was gone.